It begins with a silence, the kind of silence that fills abandoned places, where the air feels heavier, where every movement unsettles the dust of a past long forgotten. In the summer of 1869, a young farmhand named Samuel Carter stepped into the old Whitmore farmhouse, a property that had stood untouched on the outskirts of Lexington, Kentucky, for nearly a decade. The Whitmores had vanished years earlier, quietly, inexplicably, leaving behind a legacy of whispers and rumor. But what Samuel would find that day would shatter the boundary between rumor and truth. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots. As he moved through the dim, musky parlor, soot stained the fireplace, its last flames smothered years ago. Torn curtains clung stubbornly to rusted rods, and the smell of mildew clung to the air like a second skin. Samuel hadn't come for treasure. He hadn't come for answers. He had been dared by fellow workers to step into this house of ill-speaking, dared to cross the threshold where others had sworn never to tread. His lantern's glow cut through the shadows, landing at last on an object that seemed strangely placed. On a narrow table by the stairwell rested a book, its leather cover cracked by age, its pages swollen with damp. It was a diary. Curiosity overcame hesitation. Samuel brushed his calloused fingers against its surface, stirring the dust that cloaked it. With a cautious breath, he opened its first page. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, the ink faded but legible. It bore a name, Clara Whitmore. This was no ordinary diary. Within those pages were confessions, memories, and secrets, not written for eyes beyond their author. It would soon become evident that what Clara had recorded was not the musings of a Southern wife or the idle notes of daily living. No, this diary was something darker, something that told of a family far removed from the genteel facade they presented to the community. And in Samuel's hands, the truth of the Whitmore family, its decay, cruelty, and ultimate collapse was about to resurface. The first entries appeared innocent enough. Clara spoke of her home, her children, and her husband, Jonathan Whitmore, a respected figure in town known for his wealth and influence. She described the farmhouse, its wide porch overlooking acres of sprawling fields, its grand oak that shaded the front lawn. Her language painted a portrait of stability, of Southern grace in the aftermath of the Civil War. But beneath that facade, a tension simmered, one that only sharpened with every passing page. The Whitmores, it became clear, were not what they seemed. Clara's entries hinted at quarrels overheard through walls, of her husband's temper behind closed doors, of the fear that lingered among the children when his footsteps echoed their way. She wrote of nights spent awake, clutching her diary as the house around her filled with cries muffled behind doors, arguments cut short by silence, and then, in one entry, the mask cracked open just slightly. Clara wrote of her husband's insistence on isolation. The Whitmore household grew increasingly closed off from neighbors and friends. Guests were rarely welcomed, and visits from family dwindled until they stopped altogether. "Jonathan says the world outside seeks our ruin," she noted in trembling script. "But I wonder if the ruin comes from within." Samuel turned the pages slowly, unable to pull himself away. Each passage seemed to draw him deeper into the lives of this family, as though Clara were whispering into his ear across time. He felt the intimacy of her fears, the desperation of her need to be heard. And as the pages darkened, so too did the story. One evening, Clara recorded the sound of a scream, not of quarrel but of terror. She described her children, Henry and Margaret, trembling in their shared room, whispering of a shadow that moved not outside but inside their home. She wrote of Jonathan's refusal to allow them into town, of his sudden outbursts over the smallest disobedience. Slowly, entry by entry, Clara's words grew strained, her optimism shrinking into fragments. What Samuel read no longer felt like documentation. It felt like a plea. At first, the young farmhand considered closing the book, leaving it where he had found it. But there was something in those words that clung to him, that whispered for release. And as he continued reading, the Whitmore facade dissolved even further. Clara began to speak of Jonathan's experiments. "He locks himself in the cellar," she confessed, "working by candlelight until dawn with books and tools I dare not look upon. The smell rises through the floorboards, iron and something bitter I cannot name." Samuel's hand lingered on that line, his breath caught in his chest. Experimentation? What kind of experiments could a Kentucky landowner conduct in such secrecy? Clara did not detail specifics, perhaps because she did not know them, but she wrote of her unease, of the sounds of hammering deep in the night, of Jonathan's warnings never to descend those cellar steps. The deeper Samuel read, the more the ordinary world around him began to feel distant. Clara's words pulled him into her nightmare, a nightmare unfolding in slow strokes of ink. And then came the final entry on that first night. Samuel dared turn the final page available before exhaustion overtook him. Clara wrote, "If anyone finds this, know that I tried. I tried to protect my children from what lurks within these walls. Jonathan is not the man he once was, and I fear it is not the outside world he shields us from, but himself." Samuel closed the book, his pulse trembling in his throat. The silence of the Whitmore house pressed against him once more, heavier now, as though the structure itself carried the weight of all it had witnessed. This was no mere diary. This was a confession, and Samuel knew, even as he set the volume down for a moment, that he had stepped into the beginning of something far more haunting than he could ever have imagined. It was not just the words that disturbed him. It was the certainty growing inside him that the walls held more of Clara's story than ink could capture. And Samuel, now unwillingly bound to the truth he had uncovered, would not stop until he knew exactly what had happened. To the family whose name had become both a beacon of respect and a whisper of fear in Lexington, the Whitmores had left behind more than just an empty house. They had left behind a shadow, and the diary was its first breath. The morning after his discovery, Samuel could not shake the weight of the diary. He had left the old Whitmore house before dawn, his lantern shaking in his hand as he made his way back across the empty fields. Yet even in the busy noise of his day, hauling feed, tending to the farm horses, listening half-heartedly to the chatter of fellow laborers, his thoughts returned again and again to the cracked leather book lying hidden now beneath his own pillow. It was not only the words he had read, but the sense that Clara herself was reaching out, her voice straining across decades, demanding to be heard. Samuel had stumbled upon more than a relic. He had found a witness, perhaps even a warning. That evening, as the sun dipped under the rolling Kentucky hills, Samuel lit his lamp once more and carefully opened the diary. The pages crackled faintly at his touch, as if resisting, as if knowing they carried more than any man should bear. And he read. Clara's words no longer tried to veil themselves in polite observations. What Samuel encountered now was raw, unfiltered fear. She spoke of Jonathan's sudden absences, sometimes vanishing for nights with no explanation, of how he returned with his hands stained, sometimes with soil, sometimes with something unrecognizable, but darker. She wrote of her children, Henry and little Margaret, waking her in the night, claiming they heard Jonathan speaking to the basement floor, as though to someone the rest of them could not see. "He says it is all for us," Clara confessed in one entry, "that the work he does below will secure the Whitmore legacy, that when others falter, we will survive. But it is not survival I see in his eyes, it is hunger." The children flinch when he places his hand on their shoulders. They can sense what I fear to admit, that this house is no longer theirs nor mine. It belongs to him, and to whatever has claimed him. Samuel paused, his mind racing. The way she wrote, the restrained desperation of her words, utterly convinced him these were not exaggerations nor illusions of an anxious mind. Clara had seen something no one beyond those walls had ever witnessed. The entries stretched over the months of 1861 into 1862, marking how the Whitmores gradually withdrew from society. Clara noted how neighbors rarely visited anymore, how invitations were turned away, how Jonathan's reputation, once polished by prosperity, had begun to sour under whispers. His plantation continued to produce, but fewer and fewer workers stayed under his employ. Rumors spread of his cruelty, of punishments carried out in silence at the edge of his fields. Yet in town, he carried himself as a man of dignity, his wealth shielding him from consequence, and always. Clara returned to the cellar. Jonathan's cellar became a character in her writing, a place that throbbed like a hidden organ at the heart of their lives. She described the nights when, through the floor, she felt vibrations of iron and clashing tools. The scent of smoke and blood would rise through the boards. Sometimes, she wrote, there were cries. Not human, not animal, but something in between. Clara never dared step down those stairs. And, by the way her words trembled, Samuel wondered if she feared she might not return if she ever did. One passage in particular chilled him. Margaret will not go near the basement door. She insists she saw father standing there smiling, even though he had left hours earlier. She says she saw his eyes glow in the lamplight, though I tell myself it was merely the flame. Still, I too have seen shadows where none should pass. I cannot deny it any longer. Something dwells in that space. The candle beside Samuel flickered and hissed as he read, and for a moment he felt as if he himself were Clara, writing by dying flame, clinging to the fleeting hope that her words might outlast her. Yet the diary was not only a confession of horrors. Beneath the terror, Samuel noticed the tenderness of a mother clinging to her children's innocence. Clara often described the games she played with Henry in the fields, the songs she hummed to Margaret each night, when Jonathan was absent. There was light still within her, defiant against the pressing darkness of her household. That resilience struck Samuel more deeply than the horrors themselves. Clara's voice was not only one of despair, but of survival, and perhaps against all odds of hope. But the hope did not last. Weeks later in her entries, Clara confessed to writing less often, afraid that Jonathan might find her book. Her words became shorter, more fragmented, stripped of their softness. "Henry has changed," she wrote. He grows quiet, withdrawn. Margaret clings to me endlessly, as though she knows I am slipping from her grasp. And Jonathan, he takes Henry with him now. Into the cellar. Samuel drew in a sharp breath, his pulse quickening. So this was no longer just rumor, no longer a whisper of unusual behavior. Something unspeakable was happening inside that farmhouse, and Clara, helpless, had left behind the only weapon she had, her words. And then, her final words in that section, "If my children vanish, the blame is his. I pray these pages fall into hands that may bring light, though I write knowing that light rarely reaches where men like him stand." Samuel closed the diary for the night, shaken, restless. The hollow quiet of his small cabin felt suffocating now, as though the memories of the Whitmore house had followed him back. He could smell it still, the musk, the mildew, the bitterness Clara described, as if clinging to his clothes. But he also knew something else. He could not keep this to himself. Not anymore. What Clara's diary contained wasn't merely private grief. It was testimony. Testimony of the unraveling of a family who had lived among the elite of Kentucky. Testimony that explained why a grand farmhouse stood abandoned at the edge of town, and perhaps testimony to crimes no one had ever dared name. The following morning, Samuel sat in silence at the creek behind his cabin, the diary heavy in his lap. The sun rose golden over the water, but its light offered no comfort. He asked himself, should he turn this over to the town, to the authorities, or would they dismiss him as they always had dismissed men of his station, a poor farmhand with no standing, no voice? For the first time, Samuel realized the danger that now tethered itself to him. If Clara's words were true, and if Jonathan Whitmore's legacy had not died with his disappearance, Samuel might already have stepped across a boundary from which there was no return. He closed his eyes, hearing the distant hum of the morning wind through the trees. When he opened them again, he looked down at Clara's name inked on that first page, and he knew with certainty he could not let her voice remain buried. The world had to know. The diary was not finished. There were more pages yet, more words waiting to be uncovered. And Samuel, though burdened by fear, was equally driven by a strange, undeniable duty. He would read it all. Every page, every confession, every whisper of the shadows that lingered still within that empty farmhouse. The forgotten diary had found him, and now its story consumed him whole. By the third evening, Samuel could no longer resist the pull. The diary had become more than a book to him. It was an anchor chained to his chest, each entry dragging him deeper into the Whitmore shadows. Reading alone was no longer enough. He needed to return. Dusk bled across the horizon as Samuel walked the dirt path back toward the Whitmore estate. The old farmhouse loomed against the twilight like a skeleton, its broken windows black with silence. The stories told in town, the drunken whispers at taverns, the murmured warnings that children passed to one another, echoed in Samuel's ears. Most said the house itself was cursed, that the land rejected any who lingered. But Samuel knew he carried something more damning than superstition. Clara's words carved into paper, alive in his mind, insistent upon his conscience. The farmhouse greeted him with the same musky stillness he remembered. It did not feel abandoned. It felt watchful. Samuel pushed forward, lantern in hand, the floorboards groaning as if sighing awake beneath his steps. His destination was clear this time. Not the parlor, not the staircase, but the basement door. Clara had written of the very space where Jonathan had vanished nightly into his secrets. Ed waited in the hallway just beyond the kitchen, a plain wooden door scarred by time, its iron latch stiff with rust. The closer Samuel drew, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as though the house itself opposed him. He rested one hand upon the latch. It was cold. Uneasy yet unwilling to turn back, Samuel forced it open. A stairwell descended into blackness. The lantern's glow cut only a few steps down before being swallowed whole. He thought of Clara, her trembling hand pressing words into paper, her fear of these very steps. It would have been enough to send most men back into the night. But Samuel stepped forward. The cellar was colder than the house above, damp with the breath of earth. Each step creaked against stone and wood. At the bottom, the lantern's circle revealed a floor stained dark in patches, stretching irregular across the stone. At first, Samuel thought it only the rot of damp soil, but then he saw it. Metal tools scattered across a workbench, thick with dried matter that needed no naming. Hammers, saws, nails, and shackles bolted crudely into the wall. This was no root cellar. This was a chamber of confinement. Samuel's pulse surged. Clara had written of sounds, of smells that rose through the boards. She had not exaggerated. He bent low, tracing one of the stains with the rim of his lantern. The iron scent still lingered after all those years. His breath trembled in his chest. In the corner rested something worse, a wooden trunk, its surface scarred with deep gouges. Some appeared deliberate, carved letters that Samuel leaned close to inspect. At first, they were crude, nearly illegible, but slowly the truth became clear. Initials. H.W., M.W. Henry, Margaret, Clara's children. Samuel lurched back, bile rising in his throat. He dropped his gaze to the latch, rusted shut, but he dared not open it. Not yet. On the far wall, he noticed something else strange. A stack of papers weighted beneath a broken lantern. He lifted them gently. They were brittle with age, their ink faint, but they were not Clara's hand. This was Jonathan's writing. Cold, sharp, deliberate. Words that did not flow like a diary, but rather instructions, experimentation notes. Samuel's eyes traced lines that chilled the marrow inside him. Subject failed. Durability compromised. Necessitates further testing. Children resistant. Require conditioning. The pages shook in his hand, his grip unsteady. This was not the madness of rumor. Jonathan had reduced his own family to subjects. Samuel shoved the notes back onto the bench, his breath ragged. A sudden sound above, boards creaking, as though under weight, snapped Samuel upright. He froze, lantern trembling. The house had been silent, and yet someone or something walked above. He waited, heart pounding, listening as the sound faded, replaced once more by the suffocating hush. The lantern flame hissed. Samuel forced himself up the stairwell, nearly stumbling in his rush to leave the cellar. He slammed the door behind him, clutching his ribs as if to calm the thundering of his heart. Back in the parlor, he rested against the wall, sweat damp on his neck, though the night air was cool. The house had confirmed it. Clara's diary was no invention of fear. Jonathan's hand was upon every shadow, every silence. Yet questions pressed harder. Where were Clara and her children now? The town had whispered only of disappearance, of a family that went quiet after the war. But here, in stains and shackles and notes, Samuel saw evidence of something darker, something suppressed by generations of silence. He left the house shaken, the latch to the cellar echoing in his thoughts. As the farmhouse vanished behind him under the blanket of night, he felt as though the weight of its secrets clung to his back. Back at his cabin, Samuel lit his lamp and returned to the diary, as though Clara herself demanded his attention after his descent into her house's depths. Somewhere in its pages, perhaps, she had already hinted at everything he had just witnessed and more. Her next entry read, "Henry cries when Jonathan calls him to the cellar. He knows, as I know, that love has no place down there, only demands, only the breaking of the will. I pray Margaret is spared, though I see the way Jonathan watches her measuring her silence. If I vanish, let this book remain. Let someone, anyone, know that I did not consent to his will, that my children did not deserve his hand. Samuel gripped the pages, his hand unsteady. Clara's words no longer hovered as fears. They were proof, as damning as the cellar itself. And still, he turned the next page. Because once the house has spoken, silence is no comfort. The farther Samuel walked from the Whitmore farmhouse, the more he realized that silence itself was complicit. He carried evidence in his hands, Clara's diary, Jonathan's notes, and yet when he looked to the town of Lexington, he wondered how many had already known, or at least suspected, what had passed within those walls. The next morning, Samuel set foot into town with an unease that pressed heavier than the Kentucky heat. Cobblestone streets bustled with wagons, hawkers called out their produce, and women in pressed linen skirts stepped briskly along church paths. But beneath the normal rhythm of the day lay something unspoken. The Whitmore name. Though more than a decade had passed since the family's vanishing, their presence lingered as shadow. The Whitmore fortune had been scattered, some to distant relatives, some claimed by creditors, some swallowed by time. Still, Samuel found that if he spoke the name aloud, faces hardened, tongues stilled, and eyes turned away. His first stop was the tavern at the edge of the square. The dim interior smelled of tobacco and yeast. Men gathered in clusters around tables, their voices dipping low in conspiracy. Samuel ordered little more than water, then leaned towards the barkeep, a barrel-chested man named Rourke, who had watched decades come and go from behind that scarred counter. "You were here when the Whitmores still lived in that house, weren't you?" Samuel's voice barely carried across the wooden bar. The barkeep narrowed his eyes. "You'd best let that house rot, boy. Some names don't bring good fortune when spoken past dusk," Samuel pressed. "I've read Clara Whitmore's words. Her diary. She wrote what happened in there." Rourke's thick brows furrowed. He leaned closer, voice rough and low. "And what did she write then?" "That Jonathan kept them locked away. That the children feared him. That the cellar—" Samuel stopped. The barkeep's gaze sharpened at the word. "Best you don't finish that thought," Rourke muttered, setting down a glass with finality. "Folks round here turned blind eyes, same as you'd best do. You think the sheriff didn't hear screams carried through the fields? You think neighbors didn't notice when the Whitmores shut their gates and chained their doors? But Jonathan had money, and men with money can buy silence louder than any scream." Samuel's throat tightened. He had expected whispers, but not this, raw acknowledgement. The town had known. The town had looked away. Across the tavern, one older man, slender, grey-bearded, his coat patched with age, rose slowly and shuffled towards Samuel's table. He leaned on his cane, his voice trembling but clear. "I worked those fields once, long before folks stopped staying. Ain't no secret to me, boy. The master kept young Henry near him, treated him, not as a son, as something else, as practice. The girl, Margaret, she clung to her mama like a shadow. I left the season after I saw the boy come back from the cellar with eyes I'll never forget, hollow, like he'd been emptied." The man gripped his cane as if it were the only thing anchoring him against memory. "Don't expect the law to touch those pages you hold. Men like Jonathan wrote the law in letters of gold." Samuel nodded slowly, the bitter truth sinking sharp. Clara had not only been abandoned by her husband, she had been abandoned by the very community that pretended refinement while feeding on silence. When he stepped back into the light of the street, Samuel felt the weight double. The diary was more than testimony, it was accusation. Against Jonathan, yes, but also against the townspeople who had allowed a family to dissolve into shadow without lifting a hand. That afternoon, he carried the diary to the small bookstore owned by Mr. Allen, a man known for his love of records and his sharp attention to history. If anyone might value Clara's words beyond fear, Samuel hoped it would be him. Mr. Allen was thin, bespectacled, his shop stacked with dusty ledgers and crumbling volumes. When Samuel laid Clara's diary upon the counter, the man's expression flickered with both intrigue and dread. Carefully he adjusted his spectacles, reading a passage aloud under his breath. His face grew pale. This cannot simply be burned or hidden," Allen whispered. "Do you understand what you hold?" This diary unmasks the genteel lies of an entire class. It proves what most dare not say aloud, that men like Jonathan, wrapped in fine coats and fine words, carried rot beneath. Samuel nodded. Then it deserves to be heard. Alan exhaled heavily, closing the book with trembling care. And yet those pages will not only speak against Jonathan, they will stain the town. To bring them to light will mean dragging out every silence that bought his power. You must be ready. They will try to silence you too. The warning settled deep, consuming. Samuel had not sought to become the bearer of this burden, and yet Clara's words echoed in his mind. If anyone finds this, know that I tried. That night Samuel sat by the dim glow of his cabin lamp, the diary resting before him like a trial waiting to begin. The town's refusal rang louder now than ever, and behind every refusal lay complicity. Clara had written in solitude, her voice choked by walls. Now Samuel realized her voice would only live if carried beyond them. But even as he resolved this, unease returned to him. The Whitmore house still stood, heavy with secrets. Clara's diary was unfinished. There were more pages yet, and what Samuel had glimpsed in the cellar was perhaps only the surface. Truth was not only in ink or hearsay, it still lingered in stone, wood, and earth. He looked across the dark fields toward where that house sat in shadow, pressing against the horizon. His hand tightened on the lantern. Tomorrow he would return, not as a trespasser, not as a curious boy dares into a haunted ruin, but as a man carrying testimony, and as the last chance for Clara Whitmore's forgotten voice to rise. The story did not belong only to the past. It was becoming his piece by piece, with every turn of the page and every creak of the floorboard. And he knew now with grim certainty that the deeper he pressed into the Whitmore truth, the nearer he came to discovering why Clara's words had been left unread for so long, for silence is never empty. It is built from fear. It is built from guilt. And in Lexington in 1869, silence had been built into the very bones of the town. The following afternoon, Samuel set his eyes once more on the path toward the Whitmore farmhouse. Unlike before, fear did not hold him at the gate. Clara's words burned in his pocket, a pulse against his chest, her voice urging him forward through ink. He knew that if he did not return, if he did not descend deeper into that house, the silence of Lexington would close once again over the truth, drowning it in whispers and denial. This time, Samuel carried rope, a stronger lantern, and the steadiness of purpose. No dare of farmhands drove him now. He was returning as the keeper of Clara's testimony. The Whitmore house stood unchanged, its frame creaking faintly against the breeze, its shutters hanging crooked like eyes half closed against an unwanted witness. Inside, the air was grim and still, as though welcoming back one who had already pledged some part of himself to its keeping. The floor groaned under his boots as he pressed through to the kitchen, the cellar door waiting like a wound in the wall. He pulled at the iron latch, and the door swung open with a low groan. Once more the black maw of the basement swallowed any promise of light. Samuel steadied his lantern and began to descend. The cellar air was colder than before, sharper somehow, as though the place remembered his intrusion. The stains on the stone floor lay in silence, accusing, while the shackles glimmered faintly in his lantern's glow, their iron teeth still waiting for wrists. Samuel's eyes found the wooden trunk again, the one scarred with initials. This time he forced himself forward. He set the lantern carefully above, braced his hands and pulled across the stubborn, rust-eaten latch. It gave way with a crack that startled him into stillness. When the lid creaked open, a stench of decay, old and suffocating, rushed out. Samuel covered his mouth with his sleeve, his eyes watering. Inside lay scraps of cloth stiffened with age, and beneath them, small bones, fragile, unmistakable. His lantern shook as its light fell across them. Rib fragments. A tiny femur. He could not mistake them for anything else. Children had been here. Clara's children. His knees weakened, and for a long silence he could not move, unable to wrestle the horror into comprehension. There was no need for rumor now, no need for whispered suspicions in taverns. The cellar itself was testimony. Jonathan Whitmore had reduced his family, his very blood, into fragments of bone in a wooden box, hidden under the house that once promised them shelter. Samuel's hands trembled as he lowered the lid, jaw clenched tight. His breath came shallow, forcing down the sickness rising in him. On the workbench nearby lay Jonathan's papers, brittle with time. Samuel turned them carefully, the sharp writing staring back. Where Clara's words had pleaded, Jonathan's dissected. Line after line, cold as metal. Son withstood 3 trials before breaking. Daughter proves weaker, more fragile, useless, result unsatisfactory. Requiring replacement, Samuel recoiled, bile scorching his throat. Replacement. The word was scratched deep, nearly tearing through the paper. As though Jonathan's hand pressed with manic hunger, the lantern light wavered. For an instant Samuel thought he heard a sound, soft, fleeting, like a whisper breathed through the stone. He froze, whipped his eyes to the dark corners, but nothing stirred. Only shadows stretching across stone like stains of memory. Trying to still his nerves, he pressed deeper into the cellar. Against the far wall, half buried under years of dust, he noticed a narrow door of rotting wood he had not seen before. Its frame was small, almost a crawl space, the seams lined with old nails, as though Jonathan himself had sealed it shut. Samuel crouched and forced away the boards with his knife. Splinters tore into his palm, but eventually the wood gave. Behind it lay a narrow passage, low-ceilinged, carved into the earth by rough tools. The lantern glow barely reached its end, where a hollow chamber opened, something scratched into the dirt walls. Samuel crawled through, breath ragged. At the chamber's center lay a crude circle of stones, blackened by fire, long extinguished, and around it, carved in desperate, childlike hands upon the dirt, Samuel read names. Henry, Margaret, Clara, one below the other, etched into the walls again and again until the earth itself seemed to bleed their presence. His throat closed, tears pressing unbidden to his eyes. They had been here, forced into this burrow, left to cling to the dirt with bloody fingers, leaving their names as if to outlast the darkness consuming them. Clara's pleas in her diary were not only metaphorical. She had fought with everything she had to preserve her children's memory. Even when sealed in earth, Samuel could barely breathe. The cellar pressed down, suffocating, the lantern flame sputtering as though starved of air. He crawled back into the main chamber, slammed shut the hidden door behind him, and stumbled for the stairwell. His body trembled violently as he pushed into the hall above, collapsing against the wall, gasping as though he had surfaced from drowning. The Whitmore house was no ruin to him now. It was a tomb. And Samuel alone had borne witness to its contents. That night he sat in his cabin, every nerve still raw, clutching Clara's diary as though it were her reaching hand. He knew that the bones, the markings in the dirt chamber, the writings, all of it must be revealed. But to whom? The sheriff? He would ignore it, brought into silence as in days past. The townsfolk? They would recoil, unwilling to shoulder their own years of complicity. And yet he could not burn it, could not bury it again. Clara's voice demanded more. Henry and Margaret's names, carved raw into earth, demanded more. Silence could not be permitted to return, but Samuel also knew this. The house still held weight. He had not yet uncovered Clara's fate. The diary had not ended, and until its final entry was revealed, neither would he stop. Tomorrow he would return again, for what he had seen was only proof of the cruelty. What he still sought was the ending. Clara's ending. Sleep did not come to Samuel that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the wooden trunk, the bones curled in silence, the names carved into earth with trembling, desperate hands. By the time dawn broke over the Kentucky hills, he sat rigid in his chair, Clara's diary open before him. His lantern had burned through the night, its smoke staining the air of his cabin like residue of the Whitmore cellar itself. He turned the pages slowly, careful not to miss a scratch of ink. Clara's hand, already weary and uneven in her later entries, grew even more strained. He could read her exhaustion in the strokes, almost hear her hand trembling as she pressed the pen. "I cannot endure another night," one entry began. "Jonathan keeps Henry with him now. Margaret, he spares only to remind me of consequence. I begged him yesterday, begged as no woman of my bearing should, to release us, to let us breathe air not poisoned by this cellar. He only looked through me, as though I were not his wife but another subject to measure, to test, to break." Samuel's chest tightened as he read. Clara's voice had become almost prophetic, less a diary now than a testament, a record meant for someone beyond her own life. Her next entry grew darker still. "I thought of leaving, but where could I go? The doors are locked at night, the windows barred. Jonathan sleeps with the key beneath his hand. And if I escaped alone, what then of the children? So if there is to be salvation, it must be together, or not at all. The word struck Samuel deeply, the weight of her sacrifice heavy as stone. Each line radiated despair, love, and defiance all at once. The entries began to shorten after that, broken into fragments. Henry cries less now. That frightens me. Silence suits him as it suits his father. Margaret clings still. I tell her stories of the fields, of sunlight, of wind in her hair, though I fear she will never touch such freedom again. The smell in the cellar is worse, bitter, metallic. By this point, Samuel's hands shook as he turned another page. And then there it was, an entry that drained the blood from his face. I have hidden this diary behind the loose stone at the stair. If it is found, then our voices may live. Tonight I make a choice. I will not let him take them further. Jonathan speaks of endurance, but what he seeks is only to hollow us. If I must stop him, even if it costs me everything, I will. I write these words with my children asleep beside me. May God forgive, though I know in truth forgiveness is lost to us now. The ink on the page dragged long at the final word, as though her hand had faltered, or as though she had been interrupted. Samuel stared at the entry until his vision blurred. He knew then that what had happened within those walls was not merely cruelty. It was deliberate obliteration, planned and carried out by Jonathan as method, perhaps madness, but with terrifying clarity. And Clara, who had endured beyond breaking, had met that fate with one final act not of surrender, but of resistance. He pressed the pages shut, his breath trembling. The diary was nearly at its end. Only 2 blank leaves followed untouched. Clara had written until the very last night she could. Driven by a grim purpose, Samuel resolved to return to the farmhouse once more, this time focused not on Jonathan, but on Clara herself. If she had hidden her diary behind stone at the stairwell, as she claimed, surely she had left other traces. By afternoon, he was once more at that house, its broken porch boards sagging under his boots as if groaning against his persistence. Inside, dust swirled in narrow shafts of light that pierced through cracked shutters. Samuel made for the staircase, lantern steady. He knelt, feeling along the cold stones where wood met the wall, searching for signs of disturbance. At last he found it, a stone slightly looser than the others. With effort he pried it free, sending dirt tumbling. Inside, to his shock, lay not only scraps of parchment but a small ribbon, frayed and dulled with time. He lifted it carefully, recognizing by instinct the delicate keepsake of a mother, Margaret's perhaps. The papers within the hiding space were brief, torn scraps rather than full entries. Clara's scrawled hand filled them jaggedly, as though written in haste. He will destroy us all. I cannot let him. Tonight you will sleep, my sweet children, forever beyond his reach. Samuel nearly dropped the ribbon from his hands. The words burned into him like fire. Clara had written not of fleeing, but of ending her children's suffering by her own hand, stealing them from Jonathan's grasp, not through escape, but through death. His mind recoiled violently. He refused to picture Henry and Margaret's hollow eyes finally closing, not by the father's torment, but by the mother they had clung to as their last refuge. Yet Clara's love bled through even here, in her desperation. She had seen no salvation in this world for them, only an end that freed them from Jonathan's cellar. Samuel sank against the wall, his breath torn between grief and horror. He clenched the ribbon, unable to release it. As though by holding it, he preserved not the tragedy but the tenderness behind it, Clara's refusal to let her children be broken. This revelation transformed the silence of the Whitmore farmhouse forever. It was not simply the stage where Jonathan had carried out his unspeakable practices. It had been the battlefield of a mother's last stand, her final act of defiance against the man who had destroyed all bonds of love and trust. Shadows stretched across the stairwell as Samuel rose, his lantern trembling in his grip. He now understood why Clara's voice haunted him, why her words reached through time to clutch his chest. She had entrusted her story not to the town, not to the law, but to whoever might one day step into those hallways with courage to listen. And Samuel, a lowly farmhand with no weight or standing, had become that chosen listener. Yet still questions gnawed. Clara had written of her plan, but what of Jonathan's end? Did he vanish by his own will, or had Clara's final defiance taken him down as well? The house did not answer. Its silence lingered heavy, abiding. But Samuel knew this. To uncover Jonathan's fate, he would need to dig deeper still into both the house and its town. Because while Clara's words had ended, Jonathan's shadow still stretched long across Lexington, and Samuel would not stop until he uncovered it fully. Samuel left the Whitmore house that evening, carrying Clara's ribbon in his pocket, the final scrap of her written voice pressed flat within his diary. The house seemed heavier each time he stepped beyond its walls, and yet even in distance it clung to him. What he had uncovered spoke louder than rumor, louder than whisper, but it was not yet enough. To reveal Clara's truth to Lexington would demand more than pages and bones. It would demand proof that Jonathan Whitmore had truly stood behind every cruelty. The following morning, Samuel turned his steps not back toward the farmland, but to the courthouse at the center of Lexington. Its white pillars stood gleaming, a proud facade, though Samuel knew well that neither truth nor justice always lived within its walls. He entered quietly, his boots echoing against the marble floor, and requested to see the old sheriff's ledgers. The clerk, a portly man with ink-stained fingers, frowned at the request. "You searching something specific?" "The Whitmores," Samuel said carefully. "Year of 62 through 64. The man's countenance stiffened, suspicion flickering. But without further protest, he led Samuel to the archive room, where rows of leather-bound ledgers slumped heavy against dusty shelves. Samuel's hand shook only slightly as he pulled down the volumes, flipping page after page. The entries were dry recordings of complaints, incidents, property disputes. At last he found the mention, "Report received regarding disturbances near Whitmore estate. Witness accounts indicate cries at night, lights burning past silence. Sheriff conducted visit. No charges. Family accounted for." Samuel stared at the words, anger swelling. No charges. Family accounted for. Jonathan had spoken, and the law had turned blind. Further in the record, another entry from 1863 surfaced. Worker reported grievous injury on Whitmore grounds. Stated punishment carried out at Jonathan Whitmore's instruction. Complaint withdrawn. Worker paid. The evidence was all here, not in what was written, but in what was absent. The law had known, yet silence reigned, purchased with gold and reputation. By afternoon, Samuel sought the church, hoping perhaps for baptismal or burial records that told what the sheriff's ledgers refused. The churchyard was quiet, its stones casting long shadows. Inside the pastor, an elderly Reverend Holloway received him with uncertain eyes. "You've been asking questions," the Reverend said before Samuel even spoke. His voice was weary, as though already burdened by the answer. "I'm looking for the Whitmores," Samuel admitted softly. "They're children. I've read Clara's words. I know the truth." The Reverend's jaw tightened. He gestured for Samuel to follow him to the vestry, where records were stored in ordered rows. Slowly, with hands that trembled ever so slightly, the Reverend pulled down a thin book and opened to a page near the end. No baptismal marks for Henry or Margaret after the age of 6. No burial entries either, though lines were scored faintly across the margins. "Their deaths were never recorded," Holloway confessed. "Jonathan never brought them here, never allowed a service. We asked once, but his response was final." "What did he say?" Samuel pressed. "That his family mattered only within his house, that no man of God was needed to sanctify their fate. After that, we stopped asking." Holloway's eyes fell, shame flooding his expression. "We all stopped asking." Samuel's hands tightened against the pew before him. "And Jonathan himself?" "No record." The Reverend shook his head. "None. One day he stood among us. Months later, he did not. Some say business drew him away. Some say northern creditors took him. But no record was entered. He vanished as surely as the rest." Samuel left the church with his chest heavy. Clara's last words filled him now with clarity. If she had ended her children's suffering that final night, then Jonathan's absence could not have been coincidence. Either Clara had confronted him, or Jonathan had fled the wreckage of what he himself had wrought. But there were still others who might speak. That evening, Samuel returned to the edge of town, where he sought the older workers who had once toiled on Whitmore land. Most avoided his questions, half out of fear, half out of weariness. Yet at dusk, in the back row of shanties along the tobacco fields, an old woman with a crooked spine caught him by the arm. "You search for what's best left in the dirt," she rasped. "I search for the truth," Samuel replied. Her eyes, clouded with age, held steady to his. Then know this. Jonathan did not vanish to business. He was buried by his own sins. I saw him the night he fell. Or rather, I saw the smoke that rose. From the top of the field, black as pitch, coming from the Whitmore hearth. And then silence. Never again did anyone see him step foot in town. Samuel's mouth went dry. And what of Clara? The woman hesitated. Her gaze drifted into distance, as though speaking to ghosts. Some said she ended him. Some said she ended them all, but I believe otherwise. I believe she burned the house not to erase, but to accuse. When the fire died, only stone walls stood. And no bodies carried out, only silence. A chill struck Samuel's spine. He had walked those same stone halls, still standing, untouched, but never once had he noticed the echoes of fire. Perhaps time had hidden the marks, or perhaps something darker lingered still in their bones. That night Samuel returned to his cabin with his mind caught in knots. The official records had nothing, only omissions, withdrawals, silences. The church had nothing, no burials, no rites, no acknowledgement. The townspeople whispered fragments, each terrified of saying too much, though their eyes betrayed that they knew more. The truth was clear. The town had chosen silence over scandal. Jonathan had counted on their cowardice, and Clara's voice had been left to drown in it. It was only chance or fate that Samuel had opened her diary at all. He laid the book out on his table, the frayed ribbon beside it. He thought of Henry's carved name, of Margaret's whispering scratches in the dirt, of Clara's determined hand pressing her story into paper, even while despair closed in. The official account may never tell their story. But Samuel would, even if it made him enemy to the powerful, even if it doomed his own standing in Lexington. He could not abandon them. Clara's voice had been buried for years. Now it burned inside him, demanding the world not only listen but finally answer. And yet, the question still remained. Where exactly had Jonathan's end come? The earth beneath that house likely knew the truth. And if Samuel meant to drag the full story into daylight, he would need to go deeper still. By now, the Whitmore farmhouse no longer seemed a ruin, but an open wound, festering on Lexington's edge. Samuel knew paper alone would not suffice. If the town was to ever acknowledge the truth, he needed something undeniable. Bones, remains, evidence unmoved by rumor or silence. Records had failed. Testimonies had faltered. But soil could not lie. The following dawn, Samuel packed a spade and lantern into a sack, his resolve sharp, though his hands trembled. He walked the miles to the estate beneath the weight of rising heat, cicadas screaming from trees. By the time the crooked Whitmore porch came into view, sweat dampened his shirt, but his purpose burned brighter than fatigue. He paused at the gate, gazing upon the fields stretching outward. So much labor had once been wrung from this land, yet none of its yield had saved the family that claimed it. He wondered how many workers, like the old man who had spoken to him in the tavern, had seen the truth but held their tongues. Now the only witness left faithful was the ground itself. He began where the woman's whisper had lingered in his mind. The hearth. The rumor of fire. Samuel moved inside, scanning the walls. Then, beneath the hearthstone, his lantern caught something he had overlooked before, charring deep in the creases between stone slabs, faint but undeniable. There had been fire here, as she had said, yet no ashes of bodies, only scorched stone. If Jonathan had perished in that blaze, then perhaps his remains were not consumed but hidden. Samuel stepped out into the open field behind the house, spade in hand. He walked slowly, measuring instinct against Clara's words, stopping where the soil appeared uneven near the back edge. The ground swelled high in places, indented in others as though shifted once and then forgotten. He dug. The earth was stubborn, hard-packed with years of neglect, but the spade cut into it sharply with each thrust. Hours passed. Sweat poured down his temples, his shirt plastered, arms aching. The sky grew heavy with dusk, when at last his blade struck against something solid. Metal. Samuel scraped frantically, clearing soil until a rusted hinge emerged. A box, or rather a coffin, crude and unmarked, its surface rough-hewn. His breath tore ragged as he pried at the soil with bleeding hands, revealing more of the form. Finally, his spade struck wood with a hollow crack. He dropped to his knees, lantern near, and wiped earth free until the lid was bare. A crude wooden coffin nailed shut, its boards warped, sealed fast. With a rock he struck at the lid until nails squealed free. The wood groaned as the top gave way. The stench hit instantly, earth, iron, decay embedded deep with time. Inside, pale and collapsed inward, lay bones, larger than the ones he had found in the cellar. A man's frame, skull intact, jaw broken, ribs twisted as though shattered by blunt force. Scraps of fabric clung rotten at the edges, what may once have been a fine coat. Now nothing but tatters. There could be no doubt. These were Jonathan's remains. Samuel gripped the edge of the coffin, breath trembling with revelation. Clara had done what the sheriff never would, what the town never dared. She had ended him. All her desperation, the torment in her pages, the decision whispered in those final scraps. It had led here. Clara Whitmore, silent in history, had risen in one terrible night and struck down the man who had imprisoned her children. For a long time, Samuel knelt in silence beside the grave. The cicadas faded. The farmland drifted into stillness. An ache pressed upon him, not triumph, but grief. Grief for Henry and Margaret, whose small bones lay in a chest below her house. Grief for Clara, whose hand had held love and death in the same breath. And grief for a town that had forced her into such a fate, turning their eyes away until she had no recourse but her own defiance. Slowly, he covered the coffin again. It did not feel like concealment, but recognition. Jonathan deserved no monument. His bones belonged to the soil, nameless, faceless, stripped of the power with which he had ruled. As the last of twilight gave way to night, Samuel sat in the grass, lantern by his side. The voices of town rang through his mind. The barkeep's warning, the old man's confession, the pastor's weary eyes. All of them had known fragments. Not one had spoken fully, but now Samuel knew. Clara's diary, the cellar bones, the scratches in the earth chamber, the coffin buried in the field, he could weave them together into something irrefutable. He was witness to it all. Still, one question lingered like a thorn. What had become of Clara herself? There were no remains of her among Jonathan's, nor in the cellar. No name carved into the earth beside her children's. Perhaps she had fled after the final act, leaving Lexington forever. Perhaps, too, she had chosen to fall with her children, her body concealed in ash or fire. That absence gnawed at Samuel. He wished for all the voices of the diary to be accounted for, not only Jonathan's end, but Clara's as well. Yet maybe her disappearance was its own kind of testament. Perhaps she lived in exile, forgotten by all. Her voice entrusting itself solely to her diary, waiting patiently for years until found. By the time Samuel rose and walked back toward his cabin, the ribbon pressed flat in his pocket, he knew his role was no longer that of a curious trespasser. He was the keeper of Clara Whitmore's truth. And when he next stepped into town, he would no longer ask questions. He would bring them answers, whether they wished to hear them or not. The sun was just climbing over Lexington when Samuel entered town again, Clara's diary tucked firmly under his arm, the ribbon hidden safe within its pages. His steps were heavy, pulled not only by fatigue but by the weight of what he carried, proof, testimony, evidence. His discovery at the Whitmore fields had seared itself into his mind, Jonathan's coffin, broken and nameless, and Samuel knew the time for whispers had ended. He entered the tavern first, where half the town seemed to gather with the morning heat. Men nursed coffee and spoke in voices low and muted, the air muddy with tobacco smoke. Heads turned when he stepped inside, and the conversations faltered. His name was not often spoken in town, but already his persistence at the Whitmore estate had marked him. Samuel set the diary onto the bar with a firm hand. The sound cut through the silence. "Clara Whitmore deserves to be heard," he said, his voice strong though his chest hammered. The barkeep Rourke frowned, leaning back. "Boy, I told you. Some names are best left in the ground." Samuel turned, facing the gathered tables. "You all knew. You all heard their cries, and you let Jonathan Whitmore buy your silence with coin and standing. And while you drank and prayed and looked away, Clara fought alone. She wrote every truth into these pages." He tapped the diary hard against the wood. "And her words condemn you just as surely as they do him." A murmur rippled, unease shifting through the crowd. The grey-bearded worker who had once confessed in fragments raised his eyes but said nothing. Others exchanged glances, their silence tighter than words. Samuel went on. I saw the cellar, the shackles. I found the bones of Henry and Margaret left in a chest. I dug the field behind that house and pulled Jonathan's coffin out of the soil. Do you hear me? The earth itself confesses, even if you won't. Jonathan Whitmore is gone, but his crimes are not. The tavern fell to stunned quiet. No coughs, no movement, just the collective weight of words that had never been spoken aloud. At last, one of the younger men at a table muttered, "And what do you expect us to do, Carter?" "The Whitmores have been ghosts near 15 years. Samuel's eyes burned with conviction. "I expect you to name it for what it was. To stop pretending it was anything less than cruelty of the worst kind. Clara tried to survive for her children. She left her testimony because she knew no one else would defend them. If you continue to bury it, then every one of you becomes his accomplice still." The barkeep's jaw tightened. "And you, boy, you'll turn this town against itself? Against its own name?" Samuel stared back, his voice steady. "I'll turn this town toward truth. Whether you face it or not is your choice. But I won't let Clara's voice rot in silence." He left the tavern with the diary still under his arm, but something had shifted in the air. The crowd did not jeer, did not laugh, did not dismiss him. They had no words at all. Silence was breaking. Whether through shame or fear did not matter. What mattered was that no man there could claim ignorance again. Next, Samuel carried the diary to Reverend Holloway. He laid it upon the altar, ribbon unfolded like a relic. The Reverend read one passage, then another. His face grew pale, his lips trembling against words unsaid. When at last he closed the diary, tears streaked his sunken cheeks. "I failed them," Holloway whispered. "We all failed them. I preached salvation while children suffered a mile away. God forgive me," Samuel's voice was steel. "Then do not fail them again. Speak their names from this altar. Tell them Henry and Margaret lived, loved, and died. Not shadows, not forgotten. And tell them Clara was more than a rumor. She was mother, protector, witness, and she deserves her place among the remembered." The Reverend nodded, broken. "I will." By sundown, word had spread through Lexington. Samuel walked the streets with head lowered, but ears pricked to hear fragments whispered on porches and corners. Clara's diary. Bones in the cellar. Jonathan's coffin. The things once whispered half-jokingly were spoken now with trembling fear, and for the first time, not disbelief but recognition. That night, townsfolk gathered at the church. The pews, once indifferent, filled with men and women who had avoided the question for so long. And with the diary open before him, Reverend Holloway read aloud Clara's own words, her fears, her confessions, her choices. The silence in that room was unlike anything Samuel had heard before. A silence that did not dismiss but held grief. Mothers clutched their children tighter. A few men lowered their heads into their hands. When Clara's final words were read, "Tonight I make a choice. I will not let him take them further." The air itself seemed to ache. For the first time in more than a decade, Clara Whitmore's voice filled Lexington not as whisper, not as rumor, but as testament. When the reading ended, the Reverend closed his book and raised his head. "The Whitmore's graves may not stand in our yard, but tonight we carve their memory here. And Jonathan Whitmore, let his name be stripped of honor, remembered only as the ruin he wrought." The congregation bowed their heads, and though shame lingered heavy, Samuel felt the truth at last stirring like wind through locked doors. Clara, Henry, and Margaret were no longer forgotten. Samuel stepped from the church into the cool of night. The diary weighed less now, not because its burden had vanished, but because it had been shared. He lifted his eyes to the stars rising above Lexington, and though grief pressed close, he knew that silence no longer owned the Whitmore name. Still, his heart turned toward the house, shadowed and broken on the horizon. It remained, empty yet echoing, a monument to the story he had carried out of its cellar. He wondered if one final visit remained, one farewell, not to dig or to search, but to stand among its ghosts and leave them peace. The town of Lexington had heard Clara's words. For the first time in years, her name no longer lingered only as rumor and unease, but as a voice carried into the open. And yet Samuel felt unfinished, as if the weight he bore still tethered him not to the town, not to the people who had ignored her cries, but to the house itself. For all that had been spoken, the Whitmore farmhouse still stood, silent, sagging against time, holding its ghosts in every creak and shadow. It was not justice he sought any longer. Justice had been denied the Whitmores long ago. What Samuel wanted, what Clara deserved, was closure. One final act of remembrance beneath the roof, where she had written her cries in ink and hidden them with trembling hands. He returned at dusk. The farmhouse looked smaller now, though no less haunting, as though speaking the truth aloud had stripped power from its walls. Still, its silence hummed against him as Samuel stepped onto the porch, lantern steady in his grip. He crossed through the door not with fear but with final intention. The rooms lay unchanged, the parlor still clothed in dust, the curtains still faded rags against broken panes. He moved slowly from room to room, whispering the names softly as he walked. Clara, Henry, Margaret. Words meant not to summon but to acknowledge, a farewell spoken to walls that had swallowed their voices. At the stairwell, Samuel knelt again at the stone where Clara's scraps had been tucked away. He removed the ribbon from his pocket, frayed and fragile, and set it gently into the space where she had hidden her last fragments of hope. He left it there, restoring it to the house itself. Her voice had already been carried to the world. What remained belonged here in the place she had fought, endured and loved till the end. The cellar door waited, dark and heavy. For a moment Samuel hesitated, lantern shaking faintly. Then he opened it once more and descended. The chamber below still stank of earth and rust. The trunk sat where he had left it. The shackles clung to walls, the hidden crawl space sealed again with boards. All of it remained a cruel monument to Jonathan Whitmore's hunger for dominance. Yet tonight Samuel did not search for horrors. Tonight he lit the cellar fully, setting his lantern high, and spoke aloud. "Your words live, Clara. Your children's names are read in town. The truth is heard. Silence is broken." His voice echoed faintly through stone, swallowed but returning to him nonetheless. For the first time, the cellar felt less suffocating, as though its shadows had loosened their grip. He climbed from the cellar and returned to the parlor. There he laid Clara's diary flat upon the mantel above the cold hearth. Once hidden, once forgotten, it would now rest in plain sight, no longer buried in dust. And then Samuel struck a match. The house had remained a tomb long enough. Its walls still reeked of Jonathan's cruelty, still bore the weight of his labors and screams. Samuel touched the flame to the torn curtain first, then to the wood dry with age. Fire spread swiftly, hungry and bright, crawling across beams, racing upward until the house itself seemed to cry out at last. He stepped outside as smoke billowed against the bruising twilight sky. The fire roared behind him, not as secret destruction but as cleansing, final and undeniable. Samuel stood at the gate, watching the flames consume the Whitmore estate. When neighbors, roused by the glow, came running from distant fields, they found him standing tall in the wash of firelight. Some asked what he had done, why he had lit the ruin. Samuel answered in a voice steady, unwavering, "I carried Clara's truth from these walls. Now I give the rest to ash. Jonathan Whitmore will claim no monument. This house will claim no silence. Tonight it ends." The people gathered in stunned quiet, faces lit orange by the blaze. Perhaps some felt relief, others sorrow, others shame. But no one raised their hand to stop it. The ruin was allowed to burn freely, its shadows released to smoke and night. Samuel remained until the last beam collapsed, until the fire was no longer rage, but glowing embers in the soil. Then he turned back toward town, the ribbon left behind in hiding, the diary's ashes scattering through air, but Clara's voice alive still in his heart, for he understood now. Justice had never come to the Whitmores the way it should have. But remembrance was still theirs to claim, and in breaking the silence, Clara was no longer forgotten. She and her children stood not as whispers hidden in walls, but as names carried by every tongue that had heard the truth. As Samuel walked into the night, weary yet resolute, he felt the burden shift within him. Not vanished, but transformed. He was not the end of Clara's voice. He was its beginning. And so long as her words lived beyond him, so long as anyone remembered, the Whitmore horrors would remain revealed, and her defiance, her love, her final choice, would never vanish again. The Whitmore legacy had ended, but Clara's legacy had begun. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.